Welcome to episode 100 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. This podcast started way back in September of 2017, so nearly 9 years ago. Theresa May was the Prime Minister, nobody had heard of COVID, and my third book, Spain to Norway, about that cycle from Tarifa, the southernmost point of Europe, to Nordkap, the northernmost point of Europe, had just been published. And in the intervening 9 years, well, I've spoken to lots and lots of people, the great and the good of the cycling world, but also the unknown people who just have a story to tell. And if you joined me along the way, whether you were here for the first episode or whether you joined for episode 99, you're more than welcome. And let's hope that episode 100 doesn't disappoint. So here we go, episode 100. I will stop mentioning that it's episode 100, but it is quite an achievement, so there we go. In a few minutes, we're going to be listening to a chap called Richard Fairhurst. Some of you may know him. He's the person who is behind the mapping navigation app, Cycle.Travel. So we'll be hearing from him in a few minutes. We're also going to be hearing from Mark Skidmore. A while back, a few podcasts ago, I kind of put out a call for somebody to advise me as to which other podcasts are out there that people should be listening to if they're interested in cycling travel. And Mark has kindly recorded a short monologue with his own personal recommendations. But before we get to either Richard or Mark, I have some personal news. It's personal, and it's regarding the books that I've written. Now, many people come to this podcast because they've read the books that I've written. The first one, Crossing Europe, was written in 2011 about a 2010 trip from where I was living at the time, Reading, in southern England, down to visit a friend in southern Italy. And I wrote the book Crossing Europe the following year about that journey. It was well received, and 3 years later, 3 years after the original trip in 2013, I decided to set off again, but this time with the intention of writing a book, and I cycled from Athens to southern Portugal, and the second book, Along the Med, was published in 2014. In 2015, I set off from Tarifa to cycle all the way up to Nordkap in Norway. That was the book I mentioned a few moments ago in the introduction. And then more recently, Le Grand Tour was about a 2022 journey all the way around France, into the Alps and down the Rhine, a circular trip basically from Rotterdam to Rotterdam, and that was Le Grand Tour. Now, they've all been published as traditional books. However, a few weeks ago, I was contacted by a publishing company who were interested in buying the audiobook rights to the books. And the good news is that at some point this summer, I'll be spending probably a couple of weeks in a darkened room in a studio in London recording the 4 books, which means that at some point in the next 6 to 12 months, the audiobook versions of all 4 books should be available to download. So it may be that some of you have never read the books. It may be that some of you have read the books and want to revisit them. It may be that you've read 1 or 2 of them and want to catch up on the others. But it's another opportunity, or an opportunity, to do just that. I started rereading book 1 actually only a couple of months ago, and it's amazing what you do forget. So I'm actually looking forward to rereading them and being recorded rereading them in order to produce the audiobooks. So that's to come in the next 6 to 12 months. Anyway, back to the podcast. Richard Fairhurst has been recommended by quite a few people as somebody who I invite onto the podcast because lots of people use his navigation app, Cycle.Travel. So it was a delight to chat to him a few weeks ago when I was recovering from a cold, so my voice is a bit croaky. And I think he makes a fitting interviewee for episode 100. And as I always do, I started by asking him to introduce himself.
I'm Richard Fairhurst. I run Cycle.Travel, which is a navigation, planning and route guides website with a particular focus on cycle touring.
Right, thank you, Richard. Welcome to the podcast. Now, I think over the years, people have asked me or suggested that I get you on the podcast. So it seems fitting that for number 100, you're actually the star of the show. So welcome to episode 100. Before we talk about Cycle.Travel, can we go back a bit? Could you talk about you as a cyclist? Have you always been a cyclist? And what kind of cycling have you been involved in?
I have always been a cyclist. I think since I was a teenager, I used to enjoy going cycling around the countryside in Rutland, where I used to live, possibly because it was a really good way of getting out of doing rugby at school. You could choose which sport you wanted to do, and the choice between rugby, hockey, a couple of other things, and cycling, it was absolutely no contest there, really. But so I used to go off both in the school days and also at weekends, go and cycle around the county. Rutland is well known for being being the smallest county in Britain. It's also hillier than you might think. Everyone always thinks, it's just a random place in the middle of the Midlands. Actually, no, it is quite hilly. It's like a miniature Cotswolds in a lot of ways. And so, insofar as I have any climbing legs, I think they were pretty much developed by struggling up Brook Hill every Saturday and Sunday as a kid. So, yeah, I got into cycling then. Then when I would cycle to school, when I went to university, I would obviously cycle all around the place. And after that, I just sort of started going out on longer and longer bike rides, really. I remember one day just hearing some seagulls and thinking, why am I not at the seaside right now? What would I like to do? I would like to cycle to the seaside, so I went and did that. Another day when I decided that I would like to go and see some friends from university who lived up in West Yorkshire, the sort of Todmorden, that sort of area, and that was, I probably should have looked at a map before embarking on that one, but yeah, that was a great ride, and yes, just got into it from there. And I think what really sort of sealed the deal for me as a cycle tourist was discovering more and more about the National Cycle Network and some of the longer routes. I started seeing all these little blue signs arriving around the place, and they'd say, you can go this way to Banbury, or you can go this way to Stratford-on-Avon. And I think, that's interesting. Why is it sending me that way? What are the lanes like that way? So as I started finding out more and more about NCN routes around the place and discovering some of the lanes they had chosen, I really started getting much more into the notion of cycle touring as a leisure thing to do.
And is it something that you've done on the continent or around the world as well as in Britain?
Yeah, so I have my pride and joy, or one of my pride and joys, is a little folding bike called New World Tourist, made by Bike Friday in America. And I tend to describe it as the ideal Eurostar bike because it is decent enough as a bike per se that you can do 60-mile days on it, but also it folds small enough to go into a bag to go on the Eurostar, so or a TGV, so you can go around France in it, and I have done. I've taken it to Germany. I've even taken it to New Zealand. The weirdest thing about taking it to New Zealand once was that I was pulling the suitcase across Auckland Airport, I think it was, and it was just a completely generic Samsonite suitcase, and someone came up to me and said, have you got a Bike Friday in there? How did he know? How did he know that? Did I just look like a cycle tourist who was pulling a Bike Friday? But somehow he did. So there's clearly some sort of inner Bike Fridayness going on there.
And what's your professional or academic background?
So, professional background is that I used to write and work for magazines. So, at school, bizarrely enough, I actually started writing for a computer magazine, which was called Amstrad Action, which tells you something about the magazines at the time. It was the magazine for people with Amstrad home computers, and I sort of wrote their agony aunt column for people with technical problems. So if you wanted to get your Amstrad to do this or that and you didn't know how to do it, this was back in the early 90s, late 80s. You didn't have Google then. You would write to Amstrad Action, and a month later someone, usually me, would answer and say, actually, this is what you want to do. And that became my career. So I went off and after university went to write for a bunch of magazines. I ended up editing a magazine called Waterways World, which is sort of the main magazine for people who are into canals, rivers, boats, that sort of thing. And we have a narrow boat. I've always been interested in canals, so that was very much an interest as well. But the interesting connection with Cycle.Travel is that when I used to do stuff on the Amstrad, again, this was sort of in the early to mid-90s, you might remember that back then there was the first ever programme to find a route from one place to another, which was called Autoroute. And you would say, I want to drive from London to Manchester, and it would work out the route for you, and you could print it out on a piece of paper, take it with you. This is all way before sat-navs or any of that. And I always thought that was a fascinating bit of technology. So I had to go at writing that sort of programme for my little Amstrad. And obviously the Amstrad was not the most powerful of computers back then. So it took, a good few minutes to find a route, and it would not give you the sort of detailed the detailed instructions that you'd expect these days. But that kind of got me into doing that sort of thing. So when I started getting more into mapping stuff, and that's another story, around about 2004, 2005, I started thinking, well, hang on, you could do that sort of thing for cycling. I would like to have a route planner that finds the sort of cycle routes that I enjoy riding. And ultimately, that's what I did, and that's what became Cycle.Travel.
Right, yeah. You mentioned 2004, 2005. Is that when you started getting involved with OpenStreetMap, or is that when Cycle.Travel started?
No, it's when I started getting involved with OpenStreetMap. So OpenStreetMap was founded in 2004, I think. And for those who aren't familiar with it, OpenStreetMap is basically like Wikipedia, but for maps. So it's a map that anyone can contribute to. If you know something about your local area which isn't recorded on the map, you just go along, you click edit, and you plot it on the map. And it has a great advantage over Wikipedia in that it's purely factual. So we don't have quite so many arguments. If you look at a lot of controversial Wikipedia pages, how do you police the Wikipedia page about Donald Trump? How do you do that? It's just constant arguments about Trump is the best thing ever, no, he isn't, and so on. OpenStreetMap is, I don't think we're going to have too much argument there about what he is, but that's another question. But OpenStreetMap is factual, so the road outside my house is called Market Street. There's no argument about that. There's a sign at the end of the road saying this is Market Street. So it works really well as that sort of collaborative model. And what had happened was around about that time, 2003, 2004, a bunch of different people had exactly the same idea, that you could do Wikipedia for maps, that you could do this collaborative way of drawing up a map. And we all sort of coalesced around one of the projects, which was called OpenStreetMap. And so I started getting more into that. I wrote some of the software that helped people contribute to the map. I served on the board of the OpenStreetMap Foundation a couple of times. And large parts of my life over the past 20 years have been devoted to working with OpenStreetMap in one way or another. So one of the lovely things about OpenStreetMap is that lots of the contributors are cyclists. I think there's always been this desire among cyclists to have a really decent cycling map. And pretty soon we happened upon OpenStreetMap as a good way of making that happen. So people would go out and survey their local area, paying particular attention to things that are important for cycling. So, cut-throughs that might save you 2 miles going around the houses, or things about one-way streets that are not one-way for bikes, all of that sort of thing. And it's become basically almost every single cycle map in the world now is based on OpenStreetMap or one way or another.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask actually, do you think OpenStreetMap is probably used by more people than actually they realise, because a lot of websites do use it as their source of a map rather than, say, Google or Apple. So presumably a lot of people are using it without actually necessarily realising that they are actually using it. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes, very much correct. So if you go onto Facebook and you see a little map at the corner showing where a particular event is, that's from OpenStreetMap. If you go on to Booking.com or Rightmove or something like that, a lot of the time the map you see will come from OpenStreetMap. And then, of course, there are a million and one apps, your Commutes and Stravas and all of this sort of thing of this world, all essentially are based on OpenStreetMap mapping. So yeah, it is everywhere. And I remember the first time I realised that this had got a life beyond just a bunch of us enthusiasts doing things. I went on holiday. This is years and years ago. I went on holiday to China, and it was a fabulous holiday. Really enjoyed it. Now, the Chinese government does not want people surveying their country unofficially, because there are security implications, or at least they think there are. And so, being a good OpenStreetMapper, I kind of saw that as a bit of a red rag to a bull, really, and thought, well, I'm not going to go in all these places in China and not do a little bit of surveying for OpenStreetMap while I'm there. So I had my little Garmin GPS tucked in my backpack pocket, and as I was walking around, it was tracking where I was going. And when I got home, safely out of the reach of the Chinese government, at least you'd hope so, I would upload all of this to OpenStreetMap, and that would help make the map better, which is fine. And I didn't get arrested by the Chinese government, so that's all good. Except when I got back to Britain and I was about to upload this stuff, I found it had already been done. That actually a bunch of German guys had gone there on holiday and mapped the places I'd been already. So I thought, well, this is it. This has now gone beyond just a bunch of friends uploading their travels onto this. This is now becoming a project with its own momentum, and it really has done.
So what was the impetus then for creating Cycle.Travel? Couldn't you have created something using OpenStreetMap itself? Because there is the cycling layer on OpenStreetMap, and I seem to remember I have used it in the past. It was a good source of finding the exact route of the Eurovelos, so I definitely have used OpenStreetMap by going to the website and just following the track of the Eurovelos, for example. Wasn't it possible to develop something within that website, within that framework? Why did you feel it was necessary to create something different, Cycle.Travel?
Sure. So I think, as you alluded earlier, a lot of people experience OpenStreetMap who don't realise that they're doing so. Basically, it's a bit different to Wikipedia in that way, in that most people who interact with Wikipedia do so at wikipedia.org. You go to the Wikipedia website, you read a Wikipedia article, you are on Wikipedia at that point. With OpenStreetMap, it isn't. With OpenStreetMap, it's very much that OSM provides the mapping data, and it encourages other people to go off and do amazing things with it. So that is why you will see your Rightmove or your Facebook or whatever it might be map made from OSM data. It's very much the intention of the project. So when I wanted to build Cycle.Travel, it was more important, I thought, that I could do something that that made the sort of routes that I enjoy cycling, rather than trying to go through argument by committee and say, let's put this as a cycle routing feature on OpenStreetMap.org, because then you've got to sort of work with lots of people who have different opinions, and they might say, well, no, I really want this cycling feature to take a route up the A46 or the A38 or whatever it is, because that gets me to where I want to be faster. And, fine, but that's not the sort of thing I want to build. I wanted to build something that chooses the sort of route that I enjoy cycling, and that's very much what Cycle.Travel is.
Wasn't it a bit daunting to begin with, the thought of creating something which would give cycling directions on a potentially global level? You're one person. Where do you start? Where do you start to actually create something as useful and as widespread in terms of its global reach as Cycle.Travel?
It's kind of weird that you mentioned that, actually. Friend of mine came up with an interesting observation on this, which is that I've never really thought of it as weird. And I think the reason why is going back to when I was growing up and the computer I had was a little Amstrad home computer, then it was kind of expected that one person would do everything. So you would go and buy a game from W.H. Smith's that came on a cassette tape, and very often all of that game had been built by one person. At the very most, it would have been built by three people, one person doing the coding, one person doing the graphics, and one person doing the soundtrack. And that was it. So the notion that these days a computer game is written by a team of hundreds, possibly thousands, was very, very alien back then. It was, you built it yourself. And so when it came to doing Cycle.Travel, it's just how, how I expected that things were done. And it has always slightly surprised me that I do this and I do it to the best of my ability working solo, and then you see another website that does much the same sort of thing and it's got 150 people working on it, and I have to admit I sometimes find myself thinking, well, what are the other 149 people doing? But there are many different ways of doing it, but I kind of like having this focused single person way of working on it.
So it is still just you, just one person who is responsible for that website?
It is, yeah. I'd say the only slight exception to that is that I am not a brilliant graphic designer by any stretch of the imagination. So I have on occasion enlisted some help from a local expert designer who I sort of commissioned on a freelance basis to do some design work. So, for example, last year, both the Android and the iPhone apps got a bit of a new look, a bit of a sort of fresh coat of paint, and I'm going through that on the main website itself at the moment. And so, that's just freshening up the design a bit, and I commissioned someone to do that. But yeah, everything else from the route guides is, I think 90% of the route guides are things that I've written. A couple of times I've had other people who've come along and volunteered to write one, which has been lovely. But yeah, 90% of the route guides I've written. The cartography is stuff I've designed. The routing engine is stuff I've coded. The website is stuff I've coded. So yeah.
So when it started, and what year did it actually launch?
I think it was 2013. I think it started just as a handful of route guides and a route planning interface for the UK. And since then, it's grown first into Western Europe, then the whole of Europe, North America, and Australia and New Zealand. And that's where it is at the moment.
There's a lot of information on there, but originally, presumably, it was a lot simpler and it just gave directions from A to B?
Yeah, it did that, and it had route guides for a handful of UK cycle routes, a few of the more popular NCN routes. But yes, that was it, and it has grown and done a lot more over the last 13 years. Obviously one of the big changes has been that there's now an iPhone app and an Android app, because that's what people expect these days, really. But yeah, a lot of the changes have been driven by feedback. People are always very keen to say, I like it, but I wish it could do this, or I wish it could do that. And I love getting that sort of feedback. So a lot of the way it has changed since the initial incarnation has been driven by people trying it out and saying, yeah, I like it, but it'd be better if it did this.
And how much of the information is lifted from OpenStreetMap? Because now you can get detail on campsites, you can get detail on accommodation, you can get detail on the different types of road that there are, whether it's paved, unpaved. You can get, obviously, the distances. All that information, is that coming from OpenStreetMap?
It is, yeah. So OpenStreetMap is the mapping database that Cycle.Travel uses, and basically pretty much all other cycling route planners, apart from Google, use OpenStreetMap. So the difference between Cycle.Travel or Komoot or Ride with GPS or Strava or whatever it might be is about the choices that it makes with that data. So Cycle.Travel very much chooses to prioritise quieter, more scenic roads, whereas, for example, if you use Strava, your average Strava use case is getting somewhere fast to set a personal best or whatever it might be. And Cycle.Travel is not for people who want to set a personal best unless it's for the number of cafes visited in one ride. So it does take a very different approach.
I'm not a technical person. I'm not a computer person. I use computers effectively, but I don't really know how they work. Are you able to, based upon what you've just said, are you able to give information, give instructions to the algorithm that you're using to do certain things which make Cycle.Travel a better tool for cyclists specifically?
So yes, there's probably about 1,000+ lines of code in Cycle.Travel that will look at any given bit of road and give it a score. So, for example, it would look at the A14 and say, right, this is a really major road. You are allowed to cycle on it, but it's going to be a really horrible experience, so it gives it a terrible score. Whereas it will look at a little winding single track lane with very little traffic on it and say, this is a brilliant cycle road, I really enjoy cycling this sort of thing, and give it a good score. And then what it does is it works out the route between A and B which has the best score. And so the tricky bit, and the thing that makes every single route planner distinct from each other, is how you do that scoring, how you score one road over another. And yeah, that's the input to the algorithm, as it were.
My first continental long distance trip was when I cycled from Calais to Brindisi, and I've got in front of me the route I've plugged in this morning, Calais to Rome, and it's given me. I was trying to follow the Eurovelo 5. It didn't really exist on the ground at the time. There were there weren't any signposts for the Eurovelo 5, so I tended to follow regional routes where they were available, for example. Now, the route that it's given me for Calais to Rome is, in some places, it is very similar to the Eurovelo 5. In other places, it's very, very different. It does use the Eurovelo 5 when I scroll down the directions in the bottom left-hand corner. But it does take a very different route. For example, over the Alps, it takes a more easterly route. Can you explain why does it do that? How has it chosen that particular route?
So it will be weighing up a lot of factors there, and some of them will be looking for quieter roads. Some of them will be trying to avoid unnecessary climbing. So basically, if there's two roads that are otherwise equal, one of them goes up a hill and down again, and the other one stays on the level, then it will choose the flatter one. It does a bunch of other stuff as well. It looks at scenery, so sort of judged on the surroundings that it's going through, the landforms. Valley roads are generally more interesting to cycle along than roads across the fens, that sort of thing. And so it weighs up all of these different things and comes up with something that it thinks is the best score. Now, obviously, there is no right answer. There is no single best route between Calais and Brindisi. So what you can do is say, well, actually, I would like to go via, I don't know, let's say I want to go via Geneva. So I would just drag the route over to Geneva, and hey presto, it will do that, and it will adapt the route accordingly. And so I've just tried to do that, and it goes... it's taking a different route that looks like it's going down. Is that down the Meuse Valley? I think it's Velo Route V53. It seems to have happened upon, and it's all very adaptable like that. You can have, I think, up to about 200 via points, and people do.
So it never slavishly follows one particular route. It will always try and find the best route for that particular journey.
It will, but there is now an option where you can say, I just want to go on Waymark cycle routes. So there are 5 different routing options. The standard one, you can also tell it you want a route only on paved roads and tracks, so you don't want to go off-road at all. Conversely, you can say you want something that maximises the amount of off-road you're using, which is sort of gravel type routing, but you can also now say that you want something just on cycle routes. So if I click the cycle routes option and say from Calais to Brindisi, then it will find a route. And the interesting thing there is that there are, of course, many, many different types of routes. So sometimes it will be on Eurovelo routes, but sometimes it will choose a national route or a regional route or whatever. The only slight fly in the ointment there, which you end up discovering, is that there are gaps in the network. That sometimes it will say, well, I can't find a route from, I don't know, Calais to Brindisi on cycle routes because somewhere outside Rome, perhaps there is a 5-mile gap in the network and it can't do it. So at that point, you end up patching one together, which is partly from cycle routes and partly not. But yeah, the general idea is there. And I think, like you, I do really enjoy following Waymarked cycle routes. A lot of the rides I've done have been on French Velo routes or the NCN over here, whatever it might be. So yeah, it's very much a use case that I want to cater for.
I used Cycle.Travel last year when I was with a friend we were cycling the Vélo Français, and we had to cut down. Well, we were running out of time, so we needed to jump on a train. So I plugged in the route from, I'm trying to remember where we were, somewhere just south of Saumur to get to Poitiers. And I think it was Parthenay. Was it Parthenay to Poitiers? And I have to say, it gave us a fantastic route. I could never have come up with it by myself. And it was phenomenally straight. It took us on quiet farm paths. It took us through forests. You rescued our ability to actually get to the end of the route. Do you act upon feedback that you get? Because presumably you must be inundated with people who come back to you and say, well, actually, that didn't work out, or that was good, or it could be improved by this.
Yeah, I do get a lot of feedback. I think it sort of falls into a couple of categories. Sometimes it's just technicalities isn't quite the word, but functionality. Say I would like the app or the website to be able to do this or that, and that's usually quite a easy one to either address or say, well, okay, this is going to take however many days to code that, so I can't promise it right now, but I would like to do it. There's also sometimes mapping feedback, which is that it might say, well, I wanted a paved route, but actually it sent me along this unpaved path. And usually the reason behind that is because the road wasn't actually marked as unpaved in OpenStreetMap. So the solution there is always to go to OpenStreetMap and fix it. And then once it's fixed, then Cycle.Travel takes an update from OSM about once a month or so. So after that update, then it will work and it won't send you that way on paved routing mode. So that's fine. The thing that is more imponderable is when you've got, for example, you say you wanted to go from Parthenay to Poitiers, and you say, well, actually, I think there was a better route and it could have gone this way. And that's always quite an interesting one to look at, because I tend to get a bit granular at this point and say, well, okay, why didn't it go that way? What was making it choose this particular route rather than that one? And you sometimes find that maybe the good route had half a mile of horrible main road on it, and that was throwing out the calculations and really distorting things. So it's always a balancing act to look at the choices that it makes for a particular route. But I do really enjoy working on that side of it, and there have been quite a lot of times when I've gone out for a bike ride and thought, actually, maybe it should have sent me this way instead. So I go home, fiddle around with it and adjust the algorithm so that it can find a better route.
We'll be back with Richard in a few moments, but as I mentioned at the start, a few podcasts ago, I put out a call for somebody to recommend some other cycle-travel podcasts, and Mark Skidmore has done just that, and he's recorded a monologue where he explains what his own recommendations are for listening to Cycle.Travel podcasts. So without further ado, Mark, over to you.
Listening to a recent episode, I was interested to hear Andrew speculate about the existence of other cycle touring podcasts. I thought to myself, I may not have completed a cycling trip interesting or adventurous enough to submit a monologue, but here's something I do know about. So, in my expert capacity as someone who listens to lots of podcasts, here are some recommendations. One of the better known examples is Cycle.Travel Ride, hosted by the Australian Bella Manoy. This is mostly an interview-based podcast and has been going for just over 3 years. The host is animated and enthusiastic, which may or may not be everyone's cup of tea, but she has had some fascinating guests, who tend to be of the more adventurous cycle X times around the world variety. Notable past guests have included Alistair Humphreys, Ali Denham, Mark Beaumont, and the legendary Heinz Stucker. She also sometimes features audio updates from cyclists currently in the middle of lengthy tours. For interviews with cycle tourists whose trips might be a bit more relatable to most of us mere mortals, I can recommend The Accidental Bicycle Tourist. I only recently discovered this podcast, but I'm currently working my way through the back catalogue, and it's quickly become a favourite. This is the podcast that most closely resembles the Cycling Europe podcast in its tone and content, and focuses on people who have undertaken interesting and unusual trips by bicycle. The host, Gabriel Aldez, an American now living in Germany, is a very good interviewer with a relaxed, friendly style. You may already be familiar with How to Move the Stars, since its creator, Jacob Lemansky, was a guest on episode 88 of the Cycling Europe podcast. It's essentially an episodic audiobook, with Jacob reading from the journals he wrote on a cycling trip twice around the world, and it's an interesting and honest account. If, like me, you find the very short episode length a little unfulfilling, I recommend waiting for the longer episodes that compile all the days from a single country. Or for a really marathon listen, you could try the 6-hour episode covering the whole of Europe. My final recommendation is something a little different and less well known, and has just 43 episodes released about 10 years ago. This is Hey Way, which stands for How Are You? Where Are You? It was created by a New Zealand couple who decided to move back home from London and to travel there by bike. They made this podcast whilst on their trip, as a travel journal and a way of keeping friends and family up to date. It's well made and the two hosts are entertaining to listen to. It's the perfect way to scratch your cycle touring itch when you're stuck at home or work in between trips of your own. As someone who normally tours by himself, I find listening to podcasts an ideal way to pass the long days in the saddle. Others may prefer the immersion of an audiobook, the motivational drive of music, or just the peaceful sounds of the surrounding countryside. I wonder if anyone is currently listening to me talking about listening to podcasts while cycle touring, whilst on a cycle tour themselves. If you are, please be warned. I only recently learned that cycling whilst wearing earphones is illegal in some countries, including France and Spain, and can attract a fine of €100 or more. If only the same law applied to walkers and joggers on shared-use paths, whose noise-cancelling headphones make them oblivious to frantic bell-ringing and shouts of "Excusez-moi!" Though I do hope you give my podcast recommendations a go. There is, of course, only one cycle touring podcast that is truly essential listening. So, congratulations to you, Andrew, for 100 episodes of the Cycling Europe podcast, and I hope you find the time and energy to create many more. I shall certainly enjoy listening to them as I pedal along Eurovelos with angry gendarmes in hot pursuit.
Thanks for that, Mark, and thanks for your kind comments about this podcast. He mentions some people who have themselves appeared on the Cycling Europe podcast, Ali Denham, Mark Beaumont, Jacob Lemansky. I've never had Heinz Stucker. He's the guy who spent decades, the German chap, decades and decades, cycling around the world. Alistair Humphreys. I think I've invited Alistair Humphreys onto the podcast, but he's never got back to me. He is Yorkshire-based, I think, or at least he was. So if you're listening, Alistair, and fancy appearing, well, the invitation is open. But looking back over the episodes that I have made, it's an amazing array of people and memories talking to all these different people, ranging from Paul Cheese, he was a musician, Timmy Mallet, that was interesting, Mark Beaumont, already mentioned, people involved with the Eurovelo network like Ed Lancaster, Stephen Fabes, the doctor, who cycled for many years around the world, Sarah Mitchell, the Cycling UK chief executive, the author, Simon Parker, Ian Walker, he was interesting. He'd also cycled between Nordkap and Tarifa, but he'd done it in a record-breaking amount of time. Steve Silk, the journalist and author, has appeared a couple of times. I'm just scrolling through the list here. Tim Moore, that was a real special moment, going down and meeting Tim Moore in London. They say never meet your heroes, but actually he was a really nice chap, very, very engaging, very friendly. There are lots of podcasts that I've made when I've actually been cycling myself, especially Le Grand Tour, when I actually made 8 episodes of the podcast while actually cycling through France and into the Alps. Who else have I got here? Mark Wedgwood, yeah, he cycled all the OS maps. Tim Sanders has appeared a few times. He's the chap who I actually went cycling with last summer in France. That was interesting. More recently, Eric from Wheels to Wander. Interesting. So lots of people, lots of different destinations, and every single one of them has been a pleasure to chat to. I must actually mention 2 people. Now, this is quite sad. The first person I interviewed on episode number 1 was a chap called Tim McKenna, and Tim sadly died last year. He was very open about his mental health problems, and it was very, very sad news last year to hear that he had actually died. And another person who sadly died appeared on episode 47. I went to meet Nathan Molyneux in Leeds, where he was working back in, well, it was probably 4 or 5 years ago, at the time of COVID, and he was planning a round-the-world cycle for 4 years. Sadly, in May of 2024, he was killed in a motorbike accident in Bali. So perhaps this episode should be dedicated to those 2 people who were very keen, enthusiastic cycle tourists who sadly are no longer with us. I have always been conscious of getting a whole range of people on the podcast, not just males of a certain age, which I hold my hands up, I am guilty sometimes of having males of a certain age appear on the podcast, but I am keen to get other people involved as well. Obviously, females and people of different ages, younger people, older people. So if you're one of those people and you do fancy appearing on the podcast, then please do get in touch. You can get in touch by visiting cyclingeurope.org/contact, and all the details are there to get in contact. And the other thing that I usually say is that if you fancy supporting the podcast, you can do that by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. I have to admit that I make no money whatsoever from making these podcasts, but there are costs involved. So any support that you can give is very much appreciated. Anyway, back to Richard Fairhurst and back to him talking all about Cycle.Travel. On occasions, I've resorted to using Google Maps when I've been out cycling, and it's usually when I get lost and I can't find a route. And I'll put in obviously where I am, the destination, and it does have the bike option on Google Maps. But I have to say, I have never been anything other than unimpressed by what it gives me. Now, Google is a multi-billion, trillion-dollar company employing tens of thousands of people. How is it that you, one person, sitting at home using Cycle.Travel, can produce something which is phenomenally better and more reliable than all that money and all those people who work for Google Maps?
It's an interesting one. I do sometimes wonder that myself as well. I think a lot of those thousands upon thousands of people who Google employ are based in San Francisco or places like that, and they will build the feature for the sort of cycling that they do. And so I imagine, I haven't tried it, I imagine that if you ask Google Maps for a utility commuting route across San Francisco, it probably does a really good job of it. So whereas conversely, I don't cycle across San Francisco, but I do like cycling across the English countryside and in France and wherever. So I target Cycle.Travel to do a good job for that sort of routing. So there's that, but I do agree it is a little bit strange. And there was an episode a few years back when Transport for London were getting a bit exasperated because they had spent millions upon millions on building these fabulous new cycle routes across London, new segregated cycle routes, the north-south one, the east-west one, the lovely route along the embankment, all of that sort of stuff doesn't come cheap at all. And they had built all of this, and then your average new cyclist in London would do what you would expect them to do, which is plan their route on Google Maps or on Apple Maps, and it was still sending them along dangerous streets rather than along these cycleways. And TfL were absolutely tearing their hair out. They said, what's the point of us spending millions if Google Maps is still going to send people along unsafe roads? So they got me and Martin Lucas Smith, who is the one of the two brains behind Cycle Streets, which is another independent route planner, to go to a meeting in London, which was attended by people from Google Maps and from Apple Maps and from a couple of other places, and said, okay, this is Martin, this is Richard. We want you guys to listen to them and find out how to do it, because we are getting a bit hacked off about the fact that you're not using our lovely new cycleways. And there are particular technical considerations which we went into then, and said, okay, this is some of the things you want to do. But yeah, I guess it's not a huge priority for them. Google is ultimately these days among other things, a self-driving car company. The future of their company is dependent on people continuing to travel by car, not by bike.
Feel free not to answer this, but have they never come to you and said, Richard, we'll pay you a lot of money to come and work for us, or can we buy what you've got and integrate it with our own system?
No, they haven't. I suspect I might be too small to register on their radar. But no, I have never had that conversation. And you do worry sometimes, because you see wonderful independent companies doing interesting things, and the guy from Google or Apple or whoever it is comes calling and says, I will offer you £1 million to buy your company, buy the technology, and who's going to turn that down? People don't. But then the company disappears and the website gets closed down and nothing is ever seen of it again. Maybe it becomes a tiny little feature on the big guy's corporate roadmap somewhere. And yeah, it would be a shame for that to happen. But yes, I don't have people banging on my door offering me millions of pounds to sell the technology to them.
You mentioned Komoot earlier. Was it last year? They were bought out by an Italian company who promptly sacked most of the people who work for it. It is a sad thing to happen.
It is, and I mean, Komoot's quite an interesting case, because they had, I think before they were sold, they had 150 to 200 employees, that sort of level of things. And A lot of what they did was very assertive, very aggressive marketing. So, there were influencers who were doing a lot of commute-centric content. Lots of bits of the cycling media had sort of sponsored content from Commute, and by doing that, they have got millions upon millions of users. They have become hugely successful. The interesting thing since the buyout since the acquisition, is that although they have obviously let go a lot of their staff, arguably they're actually improving the product faster than they did beforehand. You see more new features from Commute now than you did 2-3 years ago, and I genuinely don't know whether that was all stuff that they were working on beforehand, which is only now being released, or whether it's just that the new people who own it have sort of refocused things more on product development. Or I've heard suggestions that maybe they're just sort of moving faster and doing less testing as they do so. I don't know, but it is a different way of doing it.
You mentioned that they have millions of users, and again, I understand if you don't want to answer this, but how many people actually use Cycle.Travel?
Oh, I should actually be better at looking at this than I am, to be honest. I know in sort of the traditional thing to do is look at your hit count all the time and look how many downloads you've got and that sort of thing. And I don't really do that. I tend to sort of work on a more individual basis on the feedback I get. But I did notice the other day that it's coming up to, I think, about 1 million routes ever saved with Cycle.Travel. So, when people have planned a route and saved it on the website to retrieve it in the future, it's just about to take over to 1 million. So it's popular enough.
And how did you get the message out there originally? Was it all just natural growth, word of mouth, or did you actually make an effort to go and market Cycle.Travel?
It's pretty much all natural growth. And what I've found is that quite a lot of people in online forums or various bits of social media, like the website, like the app, and therefore have started telling other people on that forum or on that bit of social media about it. So initially, for example, a lot of users came from the Cycling UK CTC forum. I think that was sort of the first place that people discovered it. And I post to that forum and read things on there anyway. They're a great bunch of people. They were sort of the first keen bunch of users. And now you see there's a bunch of Facebook groups where it's now quite common. There's lots of Cycle.Travel users on there. You see quite often on Reddit, things like that. I have never done the thing of going and, paying influencers to use it, or doing deals with cycling media, or buying lots of adverts on Google or Facebook. Maybe I should. Maybe I'd be a better businessman if I don't. But most of it has been word of mouth.
But it presumably does cost to run the website, and you've got to pay for your uploading of data and the servers that you use, etc. And you mentioned the iOS and the Android apps, that costs money. So how do you actually manage to make money to cover your costs?
So basically there's 2 ways for people to support Cycle.Travel. You can either support it through the website. There's a scheme via Patreon, which is just a way of giving a couple of pounds a month to support the ongoing development and running of the website. And that gets you a couple of extra baubles, like for example you get ordnance survey mapping for that, just to say thank you, and a few other features on the website. You can also do it via the app, so you can take out a sort of little subscription to support the site and the app through that, and that all goes through the standard Google or Apple payment mechanism. And again, it's fairly low level stuff. I say that sort of if you want to support it with £2 a month or something like that, that's brilliant. Very, very grateful for that, and I'm very happy to give the access to the ordnance survey maps and other things like that. But I do try not to nickel and dime it, which is what a lot of websites do. So it's pretty common, for example, that most cycling apps you have to buy a premium account for £5 a month to get turn-by-turn navigation, to get offline maps and that sort of thing. And I'm not doing that. Everyone gets the turn-by-turn navigation. Everyone gets the offline maps. I don't want to be, the most hard-nosed businessman out there. I'm interested in it covering the costs of running it, covering some of the costs of me working on it so that I can still pay the mortgage at the end of the month, and people having a good time riding with it.
Do you have another job apart from this?
So I work freelance basically as a developer in and around mapping things. So I do mapping mostly for sort of outdoor focused stuff, so walking, cycling, boating, that sort of thing. What's really nice is that there isn't necessarily a fixed boundary between Cycle.Travel and my freelance stuff. So, for example, I build the online mapping for Cycling UK. If you go and look at the Cycling UK website and you find the map for King Alfred's Way, or one of the other really lovely routes that they do, then the technology to do that map is stuff that I have built, and it shares some of the common technology with Cycle.Travel. So Cycle.Travel in that way has become a bit of a calling card. As it goes, I would ultimately like to spend more time on Cycle.Travel and things I enjoy doing, which includes things like Cycling UK mapping, and less time on stuff which I'm just doing to pay the mortgage. And as time goes on, I can do more of that. So, I can now sometimes spend weeks at a time just concentrating on Cycle.Travel, which is great, and I really enjoy that.
There's a relatively new feature on the site where you've covered the whole country in, I've got to get this right, hexagons?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Can you explain how that works?
Sure. So really this came out of a desire to ride different roads from the ones I've already done, because you live somewhere, you go out for your ride on a Saturday afternoon or whatever it might be, and you find yourself always doing the same route. You choose sort of 6 or 7 different routes that you really like, and you always do the same ones. And I remember just once I was cycling along thinking, I've never actually been down the road that goes that way. Why have I never done that? And take a left off that way, go down there. This is a really nice road. Why have I never been down there before? So what the idea behind having the hexagons is to give a really simple way of showing the places you've already ridden, and giving an incentive to go and cover the places that you've never been. So as you ride along with the app on your handlebars, it records the places you've been through and lights up the hexagons every time you go into one. And then it uploads that back onto the website so that you can then look at your own hexagon map and say, actually, I've never been over there. That's a great shame. So next Saturday, you go out and you ride somewhere different. And, I find I do this quite a lot, that I've been along and found, I'm just calling up the hexagons as I do now, actually. So there's little holes here, and I'm thinking, I really need to go out and ride that hexagon next Saturday, because it's just, there's so many good roads that you can just otherwise neglect to ride down.
Has anybody covered the entire country in hexagons yet?
Not yet, but there are people who have covered some really amazing places, and I'm always in awe of seeing where people have been. What's quite fun is that I have a 9-year-old son, and like all 9-year-olds these days, he has his iPad and he plays games on his iPad, and he's very into how sort of gamified mechanics work on these things. And he really wants me to go further with the hexagons idea. He wants me to do trophies for people and leaderboards and that sort of thing. And so sometimes at the weekend he'll say, "Dad, can we do a bit more on the hexagons?" Because he thinks it's a brilliant idea and wants to see his name up in lights on the leaderboard. Maybe we should have an under 10s category or something like that.
No, that sounds like a cracking idea to me. Now, on the About section of the website, which I was reading earlier, there's a bit that I don't understand the references to. I'm just going to read it to you. It says, "We believe everyone everywhere has the right to ride. From a 5-year-old to an 80-year-old, from London to Lerwick, We believe unfashionable industrial towns have just as much right to quality infrastructure as the capital. Sprinkling a few grants on cycle cities is not enough. In our league table of people called John, Grimshaw, J, and Starley, J, come a lot higher than Forrester, J. What's that a reference to?
Okay, so this is I do a bit of cycle campaigning. I've been a volunteer for what's now called the Walk Wheel Cycle Trust, and used to be called Sustrans, for quite a while, looking after local national cycle network routes. And that's just because I enjoy riding the routes and thought I ought to put something back into it. And I do very, very strongly believe in cycling as a way of getting about, as well as something fun to do at the weekend and for your holidays. I think the world would be better if more people cycled for their everyday journeys, and I'm sure you do, and I'm sure lots of people do. That is increasingly a common belief, but it hasn't always been. I think if you go back even 10 years, then there was still a lot of reluctance for building high quality cycle infrastructure in Britain. Whereas, the Netherlands has been doing this since the 1970s, and every time you go and cycle over there, you see the results. It's fabulous. But, 20, 15, 10 years ago, people were saying, well, why do we need to spend money on infrastructure? Can't we just ride on the roads? And yes, if you're in the middle of nowhere and you've got a lovely quiet road, then you can. If you're in central London and you're being mowed down by taxis and buses and white vans and hire cabs all the time, then no, you can't, and that's why we need infrastructure. So the reference, sort of slightly joking reference there, is to three people called John, who I thought was quite an interesting contrast. John Grimshaw, of course, is the guy who founded Sustrans, or one of the people who founded Sustrans, and so much of the National Cycle Network and the great infrastructure that has been built as part of that, starting with the Bristol to Bath cycle path and going on to lots of rail to trail conversions and other good traffic-free cycle routes, is essentially his doing. John Starley, of course, is the inventor of the safety bicycle. So the person to whom we say thank you for bikes at all, pretty much. And I think what's rather nice is that I believe in the West Midlands they've started toying with the idea of calling their cycle network the Starley network. I don't know if they're still doing that, but certainly that was a proposal, because he was building bikes. He was building bikes in Coventry. So that's that. John Forrester is kind of the opposite view. He was an American campaigner who campaigned against infrastructure, who campaigned against separate provision for cyclists. It was all very much, well, cyclists have the right to the road as much as anyone else, which I agree with. Therefore, we do not need special provision for cyclists. And I absolutely disagree with that. We do need separate provision for cyclists because it's not an equal contest. In the contest between me on my little bike Friday and some guy in a Ford F-150 truck, it doesn't matter if we both have the right to the road. If he wants to barge me off the road, he's going to do that. So that's why we have infrastructure. And sorry, I can I can talk for hours about this stuff, and as you can probably tell, I feel quite strongly about it. But I do believe that we are turning the corner, that in Britain we are starting to see more decent quality infrastructure, especially within cities, but also elsewhere. And it comes and goes, every so often there will be an election in a particular county, and the good guys get voted out and the new people come in and say we're not going to build any cycle routes. And conversely, sometimes the opposite happens. I'm quite lucky to live in Oxfordshire, where we have a very cycle-friendly council. They have had their issues over the years, as every single council has, but they are doing good stuff. They've started doing things in Oxford around traffic-free routes and low-traffic neighbourhoods and things like that make it easier for people to cycle for their everyday journeys. And they're just starting to look at quiet lanes, which is rural routes where cyclists and walkers get priority, and they're only open for local access and not for through traffic for motor cars. So yeah, it's a good place to live for that, and I'm hopeful that we'll start to see more of that across Britain. The Dutch do it. If the Dutch do it, then yeah, we can do it too.
Well, you mentioned Todmorden earlier. I live in Calderdale at the other end of the Calder Valley, and we have just collectively, elected a council of a very different political persuasion to what we had a few weeks ago. And I do fear that the small steps that we were beginning to make in the direction of cycle infrastructure have perhaps been put at the very least on hold. I can only hope that those improvements that have been made in recent years are not jettisoned. But anyway, time will tell. But thank you for clarifying who the Grimshaw, Starley and Forrester people were, because I read that this morning and I thought, should I know these people? These people are probably, famous people in the cycling world, and thank you for putting me straight. Finally, if we were to come back to Cycle.Travel in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, how do you think it will have changed?
Ultimately, I think the core of the site is as it is and will stay as it is. It is about finding a quiet, enjoyable, scenic, low traffic route from A to B. And I'm not planning on trying to expand into the Strava performance cycling athlete market. I'm not planning to start doing sort of endurance cycling and things like that. There are loads of brilliant sites out for all of that, and there's no point in me trying to double that. What my ambition is, and what I would really like to do, is effectively the Calais-Brindisi example that you came up with earlier. I want to make Cycle.Travel come up with a really fabulous route, even for long distance challenges like that. So just as an example, last year I cycled from one end of France to the other, and I did that, of course, with Cycle.Travel. And sometimes I would just let it have its head for a day, and it would say, right, you're going this way and that way, and that was great. But sometimes I would end up dragging it from one place to another because actually there's a really picturesque village here that I want to go through, or there's this amazing route along the side of gorge or something like that. I would like to make it smart enough that it makes those decisions so that it will get you a really stunning route rather than just a safe, enjoyable one. And it's a never-ending challenge. It really is, and there's always more you can do. But I enjoy working on it, and hopefully, if you come back in 2, 3, 4 years' time and you ask it, say, I want to go to Brindisi again, then it will come up with a better and hopefully more enjoyable route.
Well, on behalf of all the people who do use it, thank you, because I think it's a brilliant tool. And like I said earlier, I take my hat off to one person working at home who's managed to create something far better, far more user-friendly, far more useful than the billions of pounds that Google have poured into the direction of their bike option on their particular website. So thank you for that. Finally, have you got any cycling plans for the summer in 2026?
I always have far too many cycling plans. I have a list of about 20, 25 routes that I want to do, all of them with a little note next to them saying, this will take however many days. And I tend to decide on them a bit at the last minute. So I'll work out, I've got 5 days when I'm not doing much. I'm going to put my bike on the Eurostar and go off and spend 5 days cycling there. So we shall see. But it's either going to be France or Britain again this year, I think. Which ones I do, I don't know. I shall come back and tell you when I've done them, and hopefully there will be a new route guide appearing on Cycle.Travel after the fact.
Well, thank you for being the guest on episode number 100. Perhaps you can come back for episode 200 and you can tell us how it's developed in, well, it's taken me 7 years, I think, to get to this one. So you've got another 7 years before you can come back and talk about how you've improved Cycle.Travel even more.
I would love that. Thank you.
Thank you. So there we go. Looking forward to episode 200 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you to Richard Fairhurst. It's actually not 7 years, it's 9 years, isn't it? 9 years of making this podcast. But thank you to Richard for taking the time to talk to me. And I do thoroughly recommend, if you haven't yet used Cycle.Travel, it is an excellent tool. Thank you also to Mark Skidmore for his podcast recommendations. And that's it. Episode 100 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to get in contact, then cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you'd like to support the podcast, cyclingeurope.org/support. So whether you've been listening for the first time for episode 100 or whether you've listened to all 100 episodes of the podcast, your continued support, your continued dedication to listening to me interview and chat to all these different people is very much appreciated. I have actually already recorded episodes 101 and 102, and hopefully they should be out very, very soon. Certainly before the end of June. There, I've said it. I'm now committed to publishing the next 2 podcasts within the next few weeks. So thank you for listening, and as I've been saying for a long, long time, thank you for listening, and happy cycling. Stop. I forgot to mention him again. Rob Ainsley, the man who provides the music to this podcast. He's a cycle tourist. He's a brilliant writer, and he's an excellent musician. I've got to know him well over the last few years, and he's appeared several times on the podcast with his words of wisdom. But his music is brilliant, and I always forget to mention and give him the credit. Rob Ainsley, look him up. He's a fantastic chap, and I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to play the full version without me on top, interrupting the music, of the theme music to the podcast. It's called Zebra Hill. And if you go to his website, Google Rob Ainsley, end to end, he's a master of the end-to-end cycling from one end of the country to another, you will find all of his music. So thank you, Rob. And with that, happy cycling and enjoy Zebra Hill.